All right. So we're going to talk about World War I today. And sorry if you hear pinging. My sister had an emergency with one of her cats, and it looks like he's not going to make it. So she's been given us updates on it via text message, and I can't turn it off when it goes to my computer. The notifications keep going off. All right. So today we're going to talk about World War I. There's going to be a lot of focus on the home front because we arrive to the war very late. Number one. Number two, it takes us a while to actually get troops sent over to Europe. So we are not actually, we don't see that much combat because it's only during the last few months of the war that American troops are on the ground. So we're going to focus more on the home front today than the conflict abroad. I apologize if you hear noises. I have Mateo hanging out over there, and then Joy is hiding in her pillow fort back there. So I will kick them out if they're too disruptive, but they wanted to sit in on our class today, apparently. All right. So World War I. I talk a lot about World War I in my world history class, History 2322. Here's a plug if you ever want to take it with me. I teach it every spring. So World War I is a very complex war. It is the first war fought on a truly global scale. So oftentimes we mention the 7 Years' War in History 1301 is the first war fought on multiple continents. But in this case, World War I is fought on multiple continents, and the fights on those continents are integrated with each other. So this really makes it a truly global conflict. There are a lot of tangled, complicated roots for the origins of World War I. To kind of simplify it for you, give you the extreme Cliff Notes version so that we can understand how we get involved. A lot of World War I boils down to national rivalries between different European powers. And those rivalries taking the form of arms races, who can have the bigger, better, most modern army and navy, competition for colonies. Remember, we talked about American territorial expansion during this time in an earlier class, but we also have really aggressive expansion of European nations into places like Africa, Asia, the Pacific at this time. So they're all competing for colonial control. And we also have a system of relatively secret alliances and treaties between different European powers, so that if you declare war on one country, you have no idea who else is going to be dragged in because they have agreements or treaties with them. What also makes World War I really interesting is that a lot of these heads of state in these European countries are actually related to each other. A lot of them are cousins, descendants of Queen Victoria of England. So World War I is messy in terms of its origins, and it gets kickstarted in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. So just to kind of give you the broad strokes of World War I, on the one side, we have the Allies, so Great Britain, France, Russia, and Japan. On the other side, we have the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Italy, like it does in World War II, switches sides midway through the war. Okay, so we like to joke in history, America always shows up late to world wars, Italy always switches sides during world wars. Okay, so do note, if you're more familiar with World War II, that these are a little bit different, okay, than the Allies and the Axis from World War II. It's a little bit different makeup. All right, so World War I starts in 1914, very quickly drags all of Europe pretty much into it. The United States, remember, is still operating under a modified version of the Monroe Doctrine, right? We talked about how you read about how Teddy Roosevelt modified the Monroe Doctrine with the Roosevelt Corollary. But the gist of the Monroe Doctrine, in addition to saying the Western Hemisphere and Latin America is kind of our sandbox, our backyard, the other part of the Monroe Doctrine was we don't want to get involved in foreign wars, especially not wars with Europe. Like, that's not our cup of tea. That's not our bag. Mateo, stop whining. Sorry. So we wanted to remain neutral. Part of that was the Monroe Doctrine, that legacy. The other part of it is, remember, we have had a recent influx at this time of immigrants from Europe. But we don't really have immigrants from just the Allies or immigrants from just the Central Powers. So there's some concern over the loyalty of these immigrant groups if we go to war. There's also progressive politicians and reformers who are afraid that if we go to war, that's going to pivot the focus away from reform and more towards winning the war. So that's going to disrupt all these progressive movements. So the United States really, for many reasons, wants to stay out of this. Naval warfare between Germany and Great Britain gets intense. Sorry, let me kick the mooing German Shepherd out of the room real quick. Go on, are you a cow or a dog? Come on. Apparently he wants to go crash my husband's class because my husband is live streaming right now with, I think, his History 1302. All right. So Americans want to remain neutral. However, Great Britain and Germany are duking it out in the seas, in the Atlantic Ocean. And what new technology, anybody know what new technology is introduced during this time period, or rather becomes most effective during this time period, is used for the first time significantly in naval warfare that changes the game? Anybody know? This is the first international conflict that successfully uses submarines on a national scale, on a wide scale. Remember, we talked about in 1301, like there's the Turtle, which is this prototypical submarine during the American Revolution. Both the Union and the Confederacy have submarines during the Civil War, with the Hunley, the Confederate one, successfully sinking a ship before itself sinking. But this is really where the submarine comes of age, and Germany has the best submarine fleet. This changes the game in naval warfare, and in fact, many people felt that this was uncivilized to use submarines because traditionally in naval warfare, you can see each other, you can announce your attack before you engage. You can't really do that with submarines. Submarines can attack, right, without notice. This is before we have sonar, that we don't have the ability to detect submarines underwater yet. So the United States gets dragged into this because Germany and Great Britain are using submarines to try to enforce a blockade of each other. A blockade, right, means you're trying to prevent people and products from getting in, right? You want to deny them supplies. So the United States wants to remain isolated from this war, and they want to remain neutral because being neutral makes the most sense because then you can still trade with everybody involved and make money. Where United States neutrality is tested is the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania was a British passenger liner that was sunk by a German U-boat. It killed about 1,200 people, including 124 Americans. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic blasted the sinking of the Lusitania, saying that it was uncivilized, that these were civilians that were attacked by the German submarine, that it was not a legitimate target of warfare. The Germans argued, however, that it was a legitimate target of warfare because the Lusitania was illegally running weapons, that they had a cargo of weapons in the hold. And guess what? They were right. That's part of the reason the Lusitania sank so fast and was so deadly, was because they were smuggling weapons. So this outraged many Americans because, again, Americans' lives were lost. I want you, however, to look me in the eyes here. This is not why the United States gets involved in the war. I repeat, the sinking of the Lusitania is not why we get involved in World War I. If you ever put that in an essay, I will fail you immediately. It's one of my pet peeves as a history professor. Okay. What this does do, however, it does not get us involved in the war, but it does get us thinking that we might be dragged into this eventually. We might want to start preparing for the possibility. Okay. So this is where Woodrow Wilson, who's the president at the time, starts to approve updates to the American Army and Navy, starting in 1915 to prepare in case we go to war. American businesses start loaning more money to the British government, in particular, to the tune of $2 billion, not adjusted into today's money, by the way. And by 1916, it appears that our attempts at remaining neutral are working. The Germans had no longer attacked passenger liners like the Lusitania, but they start resuming attacks on passenger ships in 1917. What really seals the deal for us, though, in terms of getting dragged into the war, is an intercepted message between Germany and Mexico called the Zimmermann Telegram. So the Zimmermann Telegram basically says, hey, Mexico, if you get involved in the war on the side of Germany, okay, the Central Powers, and we win the war, we will give you back all the territory you lost in the Mexican-American War. So think about that today. States like Arizona, New Mexico, California, Colorado, right? All that area. Germany is promising goes back to Mexico if Mexico helps out Germany. This is what gets us involved. If you want to say one cause, one thing gets us involved in World War I, you can say the Zimmermann Telegram. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's more correct. So what this means is that the Zimmermann Telegram, right, promising U.S. territory to Mexico, on top of the fact that the Russians were exiting the war because of what? Anybody have any idea what's happening in Russia in 1917 that might knock them out of the war? Anybody know? What's Russia busy dealing with in 1917? World history trivia of the day. They're busy dealing with the Russian Revolution, right? The arrival of the communists on the scene. So Russia's exiting. So Britain and France look like they're in trouble. So Wilson goes to Congress and asks Congress to declare war, saying that to do so would mean the world must be made safe for democracy. So that's how we get involved in the war. Now, once we declare war in April of 1917, this starts a process of gearing up for war. So progressives, remember, were reluctant to go to war because they saw war as the enemy to reform. However, when it becomes inevitable that we're going to be dragged in, then they see the war as potentially a good thing for progressive reform. That not only could maybe we get more unity, more common support behind reforms, but maybe we could also introduce progressivism worldwide, right, if we win the war. The war sees the rapid expansion of the state. Okay, when I say the state, that means the government. First of all, we need troops to fight in this war. So the United States is going to pass in Congress the Selective Service Act in 1917. Now, Julio, as a young man, what do you still have to do today according to the Selective Service Act when you turn 18?
I'm sorry, what was that again? Sorry.
When you turn 18 under the Selective Service Act, what are you required to sign up for?
Oh, to register to the Army or some stuff like that, right?
Right. You have to fill out basically a registration form that says if we ever institute a draft, right, they have your information.
Yeah, but they could take our life, but not. We can't drink at 18.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. By the way, the drinking age used to be 18. At the time of World War I, it is 18.
So what happened then?
It got raised in the 70s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so like Lavender, Mary, and I, we don't have to deal with that because the Selective Service Act only required young men to register in the case of a draft. So 24 million American men have to register. Today, we don't have a draft right now, right? But during World War I, they immediately instituted a draft, right? So random registrations would be polled, and then you would have to go into the armed forces. Okay, so under the draft, or also with a combination of volunteering, about 5 million Americans sign up for the armed forces during World War I. Okay, so the Selective Service Act is still in force today. Again, we don't have drafts currently, but the idea is if we needed to, if we went to war, we could reactivate the draft. Okay. So the draft is one example of a phenomenon that we call a total war. Okay. So a total war is a war in which every possible resource in government and economy and society is laser focused on winning the war. So your normal life as you know it stops and everything revolves around trying to win the war. Okay. So we have the draft, right? All men between the ages of 18. Usually the cutoff is mid to late 30s. During times of war, oftentimes it's extended upward. Anyways, adult men had to register for the draft. We have a number of government agencies established to oversee distribution of resources. For example, the War Industries Board was established to oversee the economy, shifting production from making civilian products to goods that was useful in war, like Jeep. Well, no, this is too early for Jeeps. Like, guns, ammunition, mortars. The Food Administration is established to oversee allocating food resources. Unlike World War II, World War II is another example of total war. Unlike World War II, we don't have mandatory rationing during World War I, but it is encouraged that people watch what they eat or try to grow more of their own food so they free up supplies. And then the War Labor Board, which was designed to work with the War Industries Board to make sure that production ran smoothly, right? That you don't have a bunch of workers striking, which affects your productivity at the factories. To help finance the war, we also raised taxes. And at this time, the income tax on the highest bracket, the rich people, jumps up to 60%. They're paying 60% of their income in taxes during World War I. Today, the number is closer to 30%. All right, so we have all of these government programs, government agencies being formed to try to make it so that we're being really efficient, we're devoting sufficient resources to fighting the war and to winning the war and producing products necessary. We also, though, have to get Americans on board with the war, right? It's kind of a tough sell to be like, yeah, we're going to go fight this war and you could possibly die, but you got to do it to defend democracy. Why am I fighting a war that Europe started? That's Europe's problem. Okay, so there's this effort to coordinate propaganda. Y'all remember what's propaganda? Anybody care to stab propaganda? Yes, Lavender.
Propaganda is like a technique used, but it's just pretty much any form of information that is given to people in order to sway them to a particular point. So it could be pamphlets, flyers, whatever, so on and so forth.
Yes, good job. Great job at defining it and giving some examples of propaganda. So yeah, so basically think of it like also as advertising to sell a war in this case. So what you have on the slide is one of the most famous examples of propaganda from World War I. So this poster reads, "Destroy this mad brute, enlist in the US Army." Okay, so let's look at this. Who is this mad brute supposed to be? Any ideas? Who's this gorilla supposed to be representing? Lavender.
Germany, or just the opposing side?
Yeah, Germany. Why do you say Germany in particular?
Because it looks like the club he's having looks like a German word on it.
Yes, so the German word is culture, right? So that's the German spelling of the word culture, right? And then there's another tip off that this is Germany. What is he wearing? He's wearing a pointy helmet. This was kind of the trademark of the German army, and in particular, the German leader, Otto von Bismarck. And this is one of my office decorations, Otto von Bismarck. See, with the same pointy hat. So I love good history puns. All right, so this is meant to be Germany. So what message are we supposed to be reading off of this poster? Germany is depicted as this mad ape with this bloody club. This is culture. What is he doing? He's kidnapped this damsel in distress, right? Lavender.
Yeah, he has like a damsel in distress, which could either represent America or just like Lady Liberty. I don't know which one.
Yeah, it's kind of unclear to see what she represents, right? Like she could represent America, she could represent sort of freedom or democracy. It's kind of hard to represent. And of course, she has her boobs out because, you know, propaganda. Clearly not drawn by a lady. And then you have in the background, right, off in the distance, you have destroyed buildings. And then he's stepping onto a shore that says America. So the message we're supposed to get from this propaganda is like, we should go and destroy Germany, because if we don't, they're going to come for us. They're going to come for your home, your rights, your family. Okay. So they're trying to paint this as we have to stop Germany, otherwise they're going to threaten you directly. The effort to produce propaganda like this is coordinated by a government agency called Committee on Public Information. A lot of folks who serve in the Committee of Public Information during World War I actually will go on to work in advertising after World War I. So the biggest kind of selling point for a lot of Americans on World War I is to focus on how World War I might affect them, their freedom, their democracy. Okay. The agency spun the war as necessary to preserve freedom, okay, through things like enlisting or buying Liberty bonds to support the war effort. They also kind of send this message that if you know, are good Americans and you support the war effort now, that will help forward your quest for liberty or belonging for immigrants during this time after the war. So there's a lot of really good examples you can find on Google Image of World War I propaganda, but it's very effective during this time period. So progressive reformers were successful in getting some reforms passed at the national level that they'd been working on for decades. They took advantage of this unity during the war to push through reforms when it comes to both women's suffrage and prohibition. So we've been talking about women's suffrage for a while now. If you took History 1301, you have already known that the women's suffrage movement officially begins in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. Women have been campaigning at this point more than almost 70 years, actually more than 70 years, to try to get the right to vote. During World War I, women supported the war effort in a couple different ways. A lot of women fundraised for the war, either raising money to send in support of the troops or selling Liberty bonds, which were like basically investment in the government to provide funds. This was the first conflict in which women were actively recruited for the armed forces not integrated into the armed forces like women are today, but rather for women-only groups within the armed forces. So about 22,000 women served overseas, mostly in support roles like nursing or cooking or being clerks. And women still pushed, even though the war was on, women still pushed at home for the right to vote. The suffragette movement during this time becomes much more sort of militant and confrontational, and really that change in the suffragette movement is represented by Alice Paul. Alice Paul is a relatively young suffragette. She had spent time in Great Britain before World War I, sort of studying the suffragette movement there. And so she kind of brought back some of the tactics of the British suffragette movement with her when she returned to the United States. For example, suffragettes during this time period would stage public protests. Like, for example, Alice Paul chained herself to the fence of the White House to protest that women weren't able to vote. She was actually sent to prison for that, and she went on a hunger strike, which resulted in the people at the prison force feeding her to prevent her from starving. Like, she was willing to starve to death in support of women's rights. If you're interested in the suffragette movement during this time period, I highly recommend the movie Iron Jawed Angels, which follows Alice Paul. So suffragists are willing to get more public, more radical, to be arrested, to be imprisoned, to protest their right to vote. Women were successful in swaying Congress and President Wilson to support women's suffrage, especially following the support women had for the war effort. So the 19th Amendment is ratified and goes into effect in 1920. So the 19th Amendment states that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex in voting. So women can first vote in 1920, okay, for the first time at the national level. This is a huge win because prior to this, suffragettes had focused on the state level. So you can see in this cartoon here from this time period, Western states actually led the way in giving women the right to vote, with Wyoming actually being one of the first territories that women got the right to vote in. But once they got past a certain sort of line on these Western states, they had a roadblock. They couldn't make any more progress at the state level. So that's why they felt they had to push for reform on the national level. So here you see sort of Lady Liberty leading the torch from these enlightened Western states where women have the right to vote and trying to bring freedom to the masses back in the East and the South. Prohibition, the temperance movement, right? Wanting to ban alcohol also gains some steam during World War I. The temperance movement sees a couple of new allies during this time period. For example, when we're so focused on productivity and efficiency, especially war material production, a lot of business owners will support the idea of temperance because they don't want, you know, like drunk and lazy workers. Urban reformers who see alcoholism as a big problem among poor population. Nativists who see banning alcohol as a way to make immigrants more American. All are supporting prohibition during this time. Similarly to the suffragettes, the prohibitionist movement had focused on state level governments first, but again, kind of hit a roadblock into getting to all states. But the war really allows them to be successful because most of the alcohol consumed at this time is beer, and the biggest beer producers are German Americans. So anti-German sentiment, because we're fighting Germany during World War I, helps to kind of push over public support at the national level. So the 18th Amendment is ratified and scheduled to go into effect in 1920, and it prohibits manufacturing and selling alcohol. Note it does not prohibit consumption, but if you can't make it and you can't buy it, you probably can't drink it. So the parallels between both these movements is, again, they had worked really long at the local and state levels for decades, but really it's going to be World War I that kind of pushes them over the edge and makes them successful at passing the reform at the national level. So the big issue here for World War I, one of the most pressing issues in World War I on the home front, is how the war affects civil liberties. Okay. In History 1301, we'd seen it happen a couple times where there was an attempt to crack down on dissent or criticism of the government during the Adams administration, our second president. We also saw some crackdown on civil liberties happen during the American Civil War, where, for example, the writ of habeas corpus, or the idea that you cannot be held indefinitely without charge, is actually suspended during the American Civil War. So there was a legitimate concern that the war is going to start to cramp Americans' ability to exercise things like freedom of speech. There's this concern that dissent or criticism is not only unpatriotic, but could be downright dangerous during time of war. So the United States is actually going to crack down on freedom of speech in the name of supporting the war effort. So in 1917, the first of these laws that's passed that cracks down on speech is the Espionage Act. Now, on the surface, the Espionage Act seems like a no-brainer. It prohibits spying. Oh, of course, we don't want, spies for the other side. It also says, we prohibit interfering with the draft. Okay, understandable. But then the last part actually outlaws what they call false statements that might hurt the war effort. What does that mean? That's the problem, is it's very, very vague and can be interpreted in many different ways. For example, the post office used the Espionage Act to actually ban foreign language or socialist publications from being mailed. The follow-up act, the Sedition Act, passed the following year, 1918, makes it even more explicit. It specifically makes dissent or criticism of the US government illegal. Now, think about it today. Americans love to complain about government, right? We love to criticize government. How many of us, in all honesty, use the raise hand button would probably be arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts? I mean, criticizing the government is as American as apple pie, man. We've always done that throughout American history. So about 2,000 people are arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Act. Half of them are convicted. The most famous person to be arrested and convicted under the Espionage Act is Eugene Debs. Remember Eugene Debs? We talked about him last week in connection with socialism and labor unions. Eugene Debs was convicted in 1918 for giving an anti-war speech. Because as a socialist, he opposed war. At his sentencing, he gives this very long, impassioned speech about the long history of dissent in the United States. Despite his impassioned speech / history lesson, Debs is actually sentenced to 10 years in prison. Okay. Debs does not end up serving all 10 years in prison. His sentence is commuted by Warren Harding in 1921, and he's released. But he's still president in 1920. Or excuse me, he's still president. He's still in prison in 1920, and he actually runs for president from prison. There's no rule that says you can't do that. And he actually receives nearly 1 million votes, which is nothing to sneeze at during this time. Okay. In addition to crackdown on civil liberties, there's also a crackdown on folks who hold more sort of radical political views. For example, Emma Goldman, who was an anarchist, feminist, labor activist, was actually tried for violating the Selective Service Act. She was trying to protest the war by messing with the draft. She will actually be deported after World War I. State and national governments passed laws targeting radicals, questioning loyalty, banning certain symbols like anarchist flags, a formal program of patriotic education in the schools, investigating people who didn't seem like they were appropriately pro-war. They encouraged people to spy on their neighbors and report radical or anti-war behavior. The Wobblies, who we talked about last week, the IWW, right, Workers of the World Unite, the big umbrella union, was actually targeted for destruction by business. Frank Little, who was a leader in the IWW, was actually lynched in Montana in 1917. Federal agents raided their offices, seized their records. So effectively, World War I destroyed the IWW as a group. So all of this is done in the name of fighting the war. So it brings up the question of what exactly is patriotism? Does patriotism allow for dissent? Does patriotism tolerate suspending civil liberties that otherwise citizens enjoy during peacetime? These are big questions that we're still wrestling with, that we're going to talk about all throughout the semester, including our last week when we talk about the Patriot Act in the wake of September 11th. So I put on this slide a cartoon, a political cartoon from this time. What do you guys think of this cartoon? Look at it for a second. What point is this cartoon trying to make? So this cartoon is pointing out the discrepancy between sort of the biblical Jesus, who was super peace-loving, right, for the most part, and making the argument that if Jesus was alive during the war, he would have been arrested and convicted under some of these laws. Okay? So it's kind of critiquing the fervor in which we're cracking down on civil liberties. Now, as I already mentioned, World War I, when it came to prohibition, anti-German sentiment helped to push prohibition into finally being realized because of the fact that many of the brewers of beer in the United States were German Americans. In 1914, when World War I starts, there are about 9 million Americans of German descent in the United States. And when I say of German descent, this means not just immigrants, but people who are descended from immigrants. In other words, who are born and raised American, right, or just of German heritage. Before the war, German Americans made up one of the largest ethnic groups in the United States. Many of them still continued to speak German at home. Continued to associate with other people of German descent through cultural institutions like Terverens or gym clubs, things like that, beer gardens, really popular places for socialization and eating. And German was the most popular foreign language learned by American students. About 25% of all Americans studied German in their schooling. Because of the war, because we were fighting Germany, even though Austria-Hungary started, it was technically Serbia started it by assassinating Austria-Hungary, but Austria-Hungary is on that side is the most key one. Because we're fighting Germany, there's this backlash against German culture. Many states, in fact, banned teaching German or speaking German. Many German words in the American vocabulary were changed. For example, hamburgers, which are named after the German city of Hamburg, get renamed as Liberty sandwiches. Sauerkraut becomes Liberty cabbage. Okay, so there's this attempt to change German words that are common in our language. Many American symphonies refused to play music by German composers. And German Americans find themselves in a tough spot. Again, many of them, their families have been in the United States for generations at this point. By 1920, German language newspapers had dropped by more than 66%. And the number of students learning German in the American education system went from 25% before the war to 1% at this time. Many German Americans responded to this by giving up their German cultural identity, by changing their names to sound less German, by stopping their German cultural practices by stopping speaking German to become more American and therefore less of a target for hatred and violence. A great example of this is my family. If you ever wonder why my last name is so weird, it's because my great-grandfather changed it during World War I. My family name when they originally came over in the 1850s was Essenmacher. So my great-great-grandfather was a whole year old when he came over on the boat in the 1850s from Germany, so effectively raised in the United States, even though not technically born here. My great-grandfather was born here and raised here, but they still spoke German at home. They lived in a very tight-knit German community in Detroit. And they could not find work during World War I, even though they were American citizens, because of their German name. So my great-grandfather, one of his brothers, and my great-great-grandfather decided that they were going to change their last name to sound less German. I don't know that Esmacher sounds less German, but that was what they went with. And they stopped speaking German at home. My grandfather, who was born in the 1920s, was the first generation, again, since my family arrived in the 1850s, to not grow up speaking German. Which is very significant given that my great-grandmother's family was also German. So my family is kind of an example of that, how basically this kind of severed our connections to our German culture and roots. It's only been my generation of the family, like myself, my sisters, my cousins, who have made an attempt to learn German. Obviously, we can't get the individual culture back, but we can at least learn the language. So World War I also had a profound impact, not just on German Americans, but on African Americans. African Americans during this war faced a tough kind of battle. They're still segregated in military service, so they still have to sign up for the draft, but if they're drafted, they are separated into all African American units led by white commanders. And generally, they were not allowed to serve in combat. They were in support roles. However, many African Americans, despite all these limitations, saw service in the armed forces as their opportunity to prove themselves as Americans and to further their argumentation that they should have the full rights of citizenship and not be denied basic civil rights. So about 400,000 African Americans served in the Army. African Americans were not allowed to serve in the Navy or the Marines at this time. And this military service, unfortunately for a lot of African Americans, did not get what they wanted out of it. When African American veterans returned from the war, with their uniforms, with their medals for service, they were still met with intense hatred and discrimination out at home. And so for many veterans, this kind of sparks this desire to agitate for more civil rights, to be more aggressive by pushing for reform. The war at home, for those who did not enter military service, also changes life for them because we start to see African Americans migrate. More and more African Americans move from the rural South to the urban North and West during World War I. Part of this is because we no longer have this influx of immigrants coming over from Europe who are kind of part of the traditional workforce at home. Men who traditionally staff factory jobs are scarce because of the draft. So this means many companies are recruiting more women and more minorities to work in factories because of this labor shortage during the war. Between 1910 and 1920, about 500,000 people leave the South. So I'm going to flip forward to the next slide for a second because it has the map. Chicago's Black population doubles during this time. New York's rises by about 66%. So you can see again, this is from 1900 to 1929, so a little bit longer of a time period. Most people are motivated not only by economic opportunities in these industrial areas in the North, but also the fact that northern states gave them more legal rights, and northern states did not have Jim Crow segregation laws. like southern states did. However, the North was not all sunshine and roses and kittens. Many people still could not get the same access to good jobs as white Americans. They still have trouble finding places to live because housing segregation is a thing. And there's still, even though there's not a formal legal system of Jim Crow, there's still an informal system of racial segregation that goes on in the North. So we're going to revisit the Great Migration when we talk about the 1930s. Y'all are actually going to read a little source about the Great Migration, not next week, but the week after. The end of the war sees a rise in violence against African Americans, not only in the South, where lynching had been very prominent during this time period, but also in the North. In East St. Louis, dozens of African Americans are killed after employers encourage Black migration and white workers see them as a threat and competition. The most notorious case of violence, because we see a wave of riots happen in 1919 after World War I ends. The most serious of these riots, which will have its 100th anniversary this year, is the Tulsa riot. It takes place in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. The death toll of the Tulsa riot is uncertain, given that many victims were very hastily buried in mass graves, some of which are still have not been discovered today. At least 300 people were killed. The likelihood is higher. And in fact, last year, in the midst of the pandemic of all times, last year, archaeologists working for the city of Tulsa actually found a likely mass burial site. So they're working this year on documenting and excavating it. So the Tulsa riot not only killed hundreds of people, it left about 10,000 African Americans homeless, and the Black section of Tulsa was completely destroyed. The Tulsa riot started after a young Black teenager was accused of tripping and falling on a white female elevator operator and therefore molesting her, even though it was an accident. So the Tulsa riot was really devastating, and it's kind of one of these landmark memories for African Americans. In fact, so much so that if you are a fan of sci-fi and television, 2 shows that aired in 2020 referenced the Tulsa riot, both the Watchmen TV series and the Lovecraft Country series both reference the Tulsa riot in their episodes as being a kind of pivotal event in the history of their characters on the show. So in the wake of all this violence and the fact that their military service did not get them the respect or recognition they wanted, there was a group of people who made the argument that they were never going to get equal rights from white people. These folks adopt the ideas of Marcus Garvey, who's seen here in the fancy hat on the slide. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican immigrant who argued that the only solution for African Americans to get full rights was to have their own nation, their own self-determination, to live completely separate from white people. His organization, the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, advocated for complete independence and self-reliance for African Americans to get the rights deserved to them. This movement continues even after Garvey is deported in the 1920s. So it's really important to note that while there were a large group of folks who, out of the war, decided that they were going to advocate even more strongly for civil rights, that there was another equally vocal group that made the argument, what's the point? White people are never going to give us equal rights. There's no point fighting for it. It's just better to be separate, because then we can ensure that we have our own rights. We're going to revisit that topic in later weeks. But right now, we are done for today. Do y'all have any questions on World War I on the home front? All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording then.